see that you are here all in this great numbers. I think the theme of informality somehow hits a rather sensitive core. Informality is, I think, it touches on a debate, and that debate has been going on for decades. And whenever you look at that debate, there's a lot of talk that informality is inefficient, that it leads to rent dissipation, that it leads to negative effects and externalities, so on and so forth, and that as a result, you need to look at solutions like formalization or privatization or even democratization. And that will be the ultimate solution to dealing with informality. And I've been feeling a little bit uncomfortable with that kind of discussion. And actually I also feel that the term informality and the term formality actually splits the debate into very dichotomous kinds of notions. And what I would like to achieve with the 3 sessions that we have at this conference, because we really have 3 sessions because there were so many people that wanted to present that we asked the organizers to have more time. So there will be 2 today and 1 tomorrow. But the main aim of these sessions is actually to move beyond dichotomous notions of formal and informal. And in that effort to try to see, are there other ways how we can conceptualize this, and as a result, are there maybe other ways how we can look at possible solutions, if solutions are necessary at all. That's a different issue. Okay, just to clarify the discussion a little bit for the coming few hours. First of all, what I would like to put on the screen here is, if we look at mainstream economics, it has certain basic premises or certain basic postulates. And to have a clear discussion, it's important that we are aware of these postulates. I'm not saying that neoclassical economics is one consistent body. That's not what I'm saying, because it's not consistent. That's something that we all need to recognize here. But it has certain postulates around which empirical validation really takes place. So these postulates are real in that sense. And in this context, it's very important for us to be aware of that. So the first one is about exogeneity, which is that it is possible to have an intentional design of institutions or an intentional design of property rights. The second one is that institutional change is actually predicated upon a balance, so predicated upon equilibrium. And at a certain point in time, institutions will balance out. And the last one is that the form of institutions is very important in thinking about institutional change, meaning looking at formal, private or democratic. And as a result, if we have these forms, then there will be economic growth, or then there will be good and sustained planning. However, the paradox exists in empiricism. So, if we look into detail, into empirical studies, and we try to link institutional forms, so private and formal or democratic, with institutional performance, which is growth or which is better planning, then the paradox becomes that it is very difficult to pinpoint the relation between form and performance. And you will see that that empirical paradox exists not just for land, but it is also for housing, it's it's also for democracy, it also touches on financial institutions, so on and so forth, you will see that it is very difficult empirically to prove the relation between institutional form and performance. Okay, moving away from this empirical paradox, right? So we have the postulates, and we try to prove the postulates, and we see that there is this empirical paradox which counts for land, housing, so on and so forth. Okay, then what I would like to put on the table is a set of contrasting postulates. And that's something that these 3 sessions are about, and that would be a good starting point for our discussions here. So, instead of exogeneity, namely that you can intentionally design institutions, I would put forward endogeneity. And that means that when you think of institutions, it is actually very difficult to have an intentional and an external kind of design of institutions and then subsequently impose these and implement these. As a simple example, when you look at the government is actually one actor of all different kinds of actors, and when it starts designing institutions, it will be inevitably sucked into an endogenous game in which its intentions water down into something completely different, which is watering down in an unintended intentionality. And I guess that most of the planners around you are aware of this, because you are aware of the difficulty of planning and the long term that is needed for planning. And this is a result of this endogenous game of bargaining, conflict, and interaction. The second one, the contrasting postulate, instead of equilibrium, we're looking at disequilibrium. And what this means is that institutions never settle. So, at whatever point in time, infinitely small you look, you will always see that institutions at that given time are still in motion, they are still in flux. And this is, of course, completely opposite and contradictory to neoclassical economics, which is completely based upon equilibrium. But what this postulate actually says is that institutions never settle. They can move fast, they can move slower, and when they move slower, that's oftentimes perceived as that institutions settle, but they are still moving. That's the difference. And lastly, that we are not having to look at the form of institution, private, formal, or public, or whatever, but that we have to look at the function of institutions, or rather that we have to understand what do institutions do at a certain time and place, and what do they mean for social actors on the ground. Just to give you a very short example, China has very recently, in 2013, decided that they want to have a unified titling system. Or basically what it means is that they want to set up a national cadaster or a national land registry. And that means that they have to have an institution that unifies land, housing, grassland, forest, waters, minerals, everything that's on top of the land, everything that's below the land. All that information and all that administration, thus authority over these resources, need to be consolidated into one organization, into one institution. Thus we are talking about a mega project of institutional design and institutional change. That's what we are talking about here. However, very interestingly, when you go on the ground and when you start to ask what has happened with the titling, you see oftentimes this. And this is an example of a land ownership title of a village school. And you have here the official part with stamps and who's the responsible persons. Here you have the description of the land, and this is the map. But what we see here is that the description of the land and the map are completely empty. Yes? So what this is actually it's an empty institution. And I have defined that as an institution that formalizes certain rules, yet in such a manner that the newly created institution is actually ineffective. So it's an institution that just exists on paper only, has only symbolic value. But the question is, can we prevent it? Can we prevent empty institutions from arising? And I think that we can. And that's also what is up for our discussions here, because it's against this backdrop that I formulated a thesis. And this thesis is called the credibility thesis. It says that we do not have to look at the form of institutions, but we have to look at their function. And if that's the case, then when institutions persist over a certain time, a certain space, they are functional, thus credible. This means that if informal settlements exist at a certain place and have persisted at a certain place, we should be really, really careful in intervening in that fabric, because that informality fulfills a certain function, and we first need to establish what that function is before we can actually think about institutional interventions. And that, I believe, might be the key to understand how things work, and might be the key how we can move on to better planning and better institutional change. How could we do that? How can we use this framework in practice? In other words, can we measure credibility? And what I would like to put up here is, this is a rather simplified table. But if we suppose there are certain indicators with which we can measure credibility of an informal settlement or of informal housing, for example. And if we find out what the level of that credibility is, it might be possible to pinpoint what the possible actions could be. So, very shortly, if it's a high level of credibility, this is the scale, this is the institutional intervention, and this is the desired effect. So if it's high, then what we could do is we could condone it. That means we accept current praxis by non-intervention, meaning we do nothing at this moment. If it goes down on the credibility scale, it's medium-high, what we could do is we could co-opt. And that means we formalize what is already done. If we go down on the scale, what we could do is we could facilitate. And that means we support what needs to be done. For example, with subsidies or with fiscal policies. If we go down again on that level, and we find out that it's medium-low, what we could do is we could prohibit. That means that we dictate what shall not be done. And lastly, if it's very low, what we could do is we could ordain. And that means that we command what must be